Okay, Mr. Rutt, thank you very much for appearing on the Parallax podcast. It's an honor. You are the host of the Jim Rutt podcast show. You are the co-initiator of Game B of the group and of the idea, and you were like chairman of the Santa Fe Institute, something that were always like very dear to my heart. I just told you that I read, all the popular books that came out in the early 2000s. And so I wanted to talk to you or with you about, the relationship between complexity, our society, and Game B a little bit. And so, just to have a quick start. So if you look at complexity and the work that has been done in the Santa Fe Institute and all the things, emergence and complex systems, attractors, catastrophe theories and whatnot. So how much of that modeled your creation of Game B?
I think a fair bit, actually. And I think that certainly Game B would not have taken the form that it has if it hadn't been for the fact that both myself and Jordan Hall, who I think you could say the two of us together, started the process. Many other people came in as well, some of whom had complexity backgrounds, including one of the early members was actually a professor at SFI, John Wilkins.
Oh.
And an evolutionary theorist, Brett Weinstein, was involved from the various earliest stages, who's also been strongly informed by complexity thinking. So I would say Game B is a result of complexity thinking as applied to social systems and the unfolding of history.
Right. And so in terms of, the modeling of a complex system, because a complex system is by definition hard to model, hard to explain. And yet Game B seems to be an approach to, get over our current predicament. So is it the idea to put one complex system, in charge of another one?
Well, a lot of questions there. Yeah, and of course it's very important. And I'd say one of the things that distinguishes Game B from certain other reform efforts is that we are not utopians, right? I think the fact that complex systems science shows us how difficult it is to predict the unfolding of a complex system. We strongly believe that we are a process, not a destination.
Oh, right.
And that's hugely important. And I would say some of the other things that are useful from a complexity perspective, one that we use a lot is the idea of thinking of our current world, which we call Game A, as a basin of attraction, quite literally. For the people who aren't up on complexity theory, think of a metal salad bowl with a marble in it, right? And the location of the marble is the current state of society in some very high dimensional phase space. And things happen and the bowl shakes around, the marble moves up and down the salad bowl. And then enough shaking happens, whether it's an endogenous societal issue, a new religion or a new political idea, or whether it's war, whether it's solar flare or 5 years of drought in the breadbasket, some shake occurs big enough for the marble to fly out of the current basin of attraction. But then the big question is, where does it land?
Right.
And I've written an essay called In Search of the Fifth Attractor, where I lay out the following hypothesis, that sooner or later, the marble is going to fly out of the current Game A salad bowl. Could be tomorrow afternoon, it might be 100 years, but there's many signs that the Game A attractor is breaking down. We can go into those if you're interested. But more interesting to me is, where does it land if it does fly out? And I laid out some of the attractors that already exist. For instance, I call it neo-fascism, China being a fine example, Russia being another. On bad days, the US shows some manifestations of that as well. Neo-dark ages, the theocratic regimes, these are, say the Islamicists. And again, there's a certain amount of dark ages thinking in the United States as well. I would say neo-feudalism, This is probably my most controversial name for an attractor. That's what I label kind of the hyper-libertarian Silicon Valley boys, right? Who, if you take their rhetoric seriously, I think you'll end up with a financially determined feudal society with a few people at top. Everybody else essentially is serfs. And then, of course, the good old fourth attractor of chaos. The whole damn system breaks down.
Yes.
And so at the conceptual level, we can think of game B as the fifth attractor. Of course, 5 is an arbitrary number. And so what we're trying to literally do is think through what it means to bootstrap a new attractor that's strong enough to capture the falling marble when it flies out of the salad bowl, and is a better attractor than all the alternatives, so that at the critical time, people will come to this attractor, not to the others.
Right. Okay. So you certainly know it better than me. I'm just referring to the books I've read basically a long time ago, but as far as I remember, the original, or one of the conceptions, was that you had like 4 attractors. You had like a static attractor, where the marble always reaches one point in the bowl. Then you have like a kind of a periodic attractor, where it can have one of 2 basic destinations. And then you have a strange attractor, which like edges on chaos, where new rules, new possibilities kind of emerge, or the possibility that there are emerge are higher, let's say it like this. And on the other side, you have chaos, right? And so
clearly society is a strange attractor, I think.
No, well, my question, would be if game B would be a strange attractor, because if you look at game A, that is like the old games, that is like old bipartisan politics, that it's all, all that. I mean, I know it's a metaphor. And so, but in terms of approaching this topic.
Yeah, and I would say, from a complexity theory perspective, game A is a strange attractor, game B is a strange attractor.
All right.
But they're in different basins, and there's a ridge when you go between attractor basins. Some event causes the marble to transition across the ridge. Either it could be a slow transition. Look at the gradual emergence out of feudalism in the West, though there were some fairly cataclysmic events along the way, including the 30 Years' War and the French Revolution. But there was no actual breakdown.
Right.
Or you look at the fairly discontinuous collapse of the Soviet Union. That was actually pretty amazing, where we went from one basin to another very rapidly. The basin they ended up in, turned out not to be a good one, as it turned out. And so think of all these as strange attractors that have tendencies. That's all attractors do. That's why they call them attractors, is to pull their state, sort of keep it within some general space, right? If you look at the old Lorentz attractor, which was the first strange attractor that was discovered, it traces this space, but doesn't get too far away from centroid. The same way our society changes all the time, but it's still recognizably game A. And for us to get away into another strange attractor means another set of trajectories for society to explore.
Right.
And I think that's another important way to think about game B, is that it's a process for exploring a high-dimensional design space for societies. And again, this is the important point I made before, that it is not a utopian vision. I can't sit here and tell you this is what a game A society looks like in 60 years.
Right.
I can say, here are some of the principles that need to be applied, and as we search for configurations in design space for societies that meet the requirements that we believe a metastable society needs to have, and manages to be successful in providing a high level of human well-being.
Right. That is super interesting that you say not utopian, because like one of the questions I had, we're now, you have noticed that you have all the conversations, but in the last kind of 5-10 years, all these new philosophies, theories, meta theories pop up, be it like metamodernism, the Dutch school metamodernism, the Swedish school, you have performatism, integral, and you have all these different approaches and ideas, what the next step is, what is emerging. So where would you locate yourself, respectively, the game B within that subculture?
Yeah, and I don't know if you've read the essay by Joe Lightfoot called "The Liminal Web."
Right.
He lays out a number of these. Right? He's fairly arbitrary collection, but it's not a bad one, I thought.
Yeah.
And I would say that Game B considers itself adjacent to several of these other communities, and we borrow. We have members that are members who are in both. Right? Particularly, I would say there's very substantial overlap between Game B and Swedish school and Danish school metamodernism.
In some ways, I bet, yes.
Yeah, there are things we disagree with quite substantially. Daniel Gortz and I have had some fairly scorching discussions about the difference.
Right.
But on the other hand, there's a lot in Swedish metamodernism that informs Game B. There's a lot of people in the Game B world, but not me, who have strong groundings in integral theory. Daniel Schmachtenberger, perhaps most famously, but many others. And I would say that their view on integral is generally that there's some useful things there, but it is very substantially incomplete and way too much wedded to particularly economic status quo. And so it was a place to come from, but it's not where we're headed towards. I would say there's a strong relationship with the regenerative ecology people, Daniel Christian Wall, Joe Brewer, many others. A new one, I just did a podcast episode about them the other day. The Doomer Optimists are a new
yes.
A new community. And they acknowledge themselves as an offspring of Game B. And I think that's reasonably accurate. I think we can think of this as a number of people. I sometimes call it the Big Change Coalition. People that are all looking at things in somewhat different ways, but all have a somewhat similar view.
Yeah, exactly.
What's wrong with the status quo and where we're going. Say, political metamodernism, for instance, as I said, I've got some strong disagreements with part of it. On the other hand, I encourage them. I think that they're part of this exploration of design space. And maybe we're wrong and they're right. So let's both do our thing and let's see who actually produces a social operating system that is actually better for human well-being and allows us to live in balance with the realistic carrying capacity of the earth.
Yeah, I just had a conversation with Timothy Vermeulen from the meta-modern school, the Dutch one, and so, or Danish-Dutch, I don't know.
There's a Danish, Lena Anderson and her friends.
Oh, no, I mean Vermeulen, I mean the Dutch school, the original.
I don't know much about them.
No, but the interesting thing, because you say utopia, is that they explicitly don't have an utopist approach like Daniel Gertz, but they just look at culture and artifacts and look of what is, and look at it's not meta in terms of coming after, more than meta in terms of metaxy. And so we're like always in between, I think Wilber would say different stages, like different memes, and we have like on one side this uncertainty, but on the other side a kind of hopeful approach, looking for a world that is coming next, and so that all these theories like are kind of commensurable with each other on one aspect and non-commensurable on other aspects. That's kind of the meta-modern condition we're in. So that would be their argument, but they're not utopian in the sense. And so because that was my idea in terms of Game B as well, it's not utopian, but it's like a looking for something else.
Yeah, it's a process,
right?
And we have some basic principles. So, for instance, a very simple one. In fact, this was the original conversation that Jordan Hall and I had that started all this back in 2009 or thereabouts, which is a society in which honesty and good faith is a sucker strategy, is a bad strategy. It has to be a bad society. And I would say Game A is a society where honesty and good faith is a bad strategy if you want to get ahead within the context of the game. So very simple virtue level. Game B must be a society where honesty and good faith is a good strategy for people.
Right.
Simple, right? Then there's other aspects that have to do with the technological context, which is very important. One of the reasons societies like Game B social operating systems haven't come into existence before is that we didn't have the necessary technical substrate. We believe, for instance, that self-organizing, network-centric, bottoms-up ways of organizing cooperative work are going to be both more efficacious and, again, better for human well-being than hierarchical command and control systems, which dominate game A today.
Right.
And that actually gets me back to another point, which I unfortunately forgot to address second time around, which is another way we describe the work of game B is to juxtapose complex systems versus complicated systems.
Right. Mm-hmm.
This is a distinction David Snowden makes and some others, that a clockwork type machinery, an automobile, a corporate bureaucracy are complicated. They're not complex. They don't have degrees of freedom. They're not biology-like. They're carefully crafted artifacts. And it's, I think, a core view of the game B movement that the right way to deal with our complex problems is with complex solutions, not complicated solutions.
Right. Okay, so that is a perfect segue to the two main questions that I have. Two questions for which I basically have no answer, but I thought, well, I have Mr. Jim Rutt on the show, and so he might have some insights to that. And I must say, I'm from my character, I'm rather somebody who likes to act, right? And so, I'm all for it, and let's find complex solutions. But what I'm asking, and I hope I phrased that right, is a question in terms of efficacy, right? And so you have a complex system, and because it's complex, it's hard to evaluate the results and the output, right? So what happens? And so how do you measure the possible negative unintended consequences against if you act in relationship to not acting at all, right? And so I give you an example what I mean. So imagine, we just had that with the Corona crisis and with the meta study of Johns Hopkins University that they said there are little indicators that the restrictions and the lockdowns actually help reduce the actual casualties of that pandemic. At the same time, it created immensely social, economic, and psychological damage. And so we kind of meddled with that system, and not necessarily for the better, right? And
we don't know even, right? We still don't know.
Right.
Who was right here? Were the Chinese right? Were the Swedes right?
Right.
Were the Australians right?
Right.
Or were the generally incompetent Europeans and Americans somehow right by accident, right?
Right.
We just don't know. It's a very complex system. And unfortunately, we just stumbled into it. An idea, which I have actually written an essay, I haven't published it yet, is called, we should establish a Department of Wicked Risks in the US government so that we are prepared to think about things like this pandemic. We had the powers that be had no ability to conceptualize exactly these questions at all. When in reality, our society is going to be confronted with more and more of these very complex challenges.
Right.
And to respond to them in complicated ways, like all the governments did, is probably not correct.
Right. And so, but, in terms of moving from game A to game B, like how much are we actually able to produce an outcome where the benefits outweigh the negative, the negatives?
And that's obviously the key. And we have theory.
No, I'm asking, is it?
Yeah, I know. And so we don't yet have practice. But the next stage in game B is to begin to put these ideas into actual practice, starting right now. And that is in two fronts. One is creating so-called proto-Bs, which are on-the-ground communities, people living together, operating in a game B fashion, including decentralized and self-organizing management, et cetera, and focus on human well-being, psychotechnologies, all the things that we talk about. At the same time, game B ventures are on the verge of starting up, which will be business enterprises that are organized along game B themes. If these don't work, then we were wrong. Or at least if they fail in ways that aren't obviously fixable. Right. It's actually okay if some of them fail, so long as we get lessons that move us towards things that don't fail. But I'm a bottom line guy. Most of my career was business, both startup entrepreneur and corporate executive and that sort of thing. So I'm a bottom line guy in some sense. I mean, stuff has to work. My favorite word is useful, for instance.
Right.
I don't really give a shit how elegant an idea is not useful. I'm not too interested in it. So game B ideas have to prove out in the real world, or they're just a failure on the family tree of interesting ideas. And we're just getting to the point now where we can start putting them into practice.
Okay, so what does it mean? What would that mean in terms of, climate change? Because we know
that's a good one.
Because let me, because we know we had the first conferences like 1990, 1988, or whenever that was, and we had regular climate conferences, and the CO2 and the heat goes up still, and you could easily make the case that it's a result of negative reinforcement, where you just the more you pressure, like with an alcoholic, you say he's wrong and he will drink more, right? And so the more pressure you add to act, the more resistance you will create. And so you have like this big industrial systems and economic systems, they don't seem to react to the ways of how policies are made. And at the same time, we don't seem to be able to react in a proper manner to the climate threat that there is. And so,
exactly. I got a good answer for that one. I've been talking with people about this a lot recently. Let's give a simple example of what does not work. Macron put a small tax on diesel fuel, and it resulted in a revolt from the rural and small town people. The Yellow Jackets revolt in France, right? And why is that? Well, because raising the price of diesel fuel ended up decreasing the well-being of those people. And most people don't want their well-being decreased, and so they react against it. And I would say that in the United States, there's a large anti-climate change faction, might be close to half the people, at least certainly 40%. Wow. And it's their perception that the moves proposed to do climate amelioration and repair will hurt them in terms of their human well-being. And here's the scary part, they're probably right. But the problem is that their definition of well-being is built in the game A modality of status through possessions and positional goods. So the game B answer to climate is actually going a different route entirely, which is first, we have to find a way of living that actually improves our well-being. So imagine these proto-Bs, communities of about 150 people that recreate face-to-face communities, recreate a lot of things that are similar to the extended families, which have been how humankind lived for most of its existence to the last 120 years or so, when most of our relationships that used to be face-to-face communities or extended family have been replaced by either government or the market, which are both sterile transactional entities that have no human warmth to them. And the resultant life is not all that good. You look at the deaths of despair that are going up, particularly in the United States, general sense of things are on the wrong track. I'm on the treadmill. This is not a fulfilling life. So the first move of game B is to find a way to recreate authentic life that increases human well-being while at the same time massively reducing the consumption of carbon and other inputs from the biosphere. So this is the trick, that if we can do it, is the road to fixing climate. Top down, Davos man, we're going to beat people into submission on climate change. It's not going to work. It's going to produce a fascist revolution is what it's going to do, right? You've got to, because you're asking people to make their well-being worse. people don't want to do that, and they're not
Right.
going to. And so make their well-being better in a method that's explicit in the method that will also produce a massive reduction in consumption of resources and carbon.
Right. So bees because of the insects, or why you call it like this, or like what is the?
No, it was very simple. The story is actually told.
But you're talking about little communities, right?
Yeah, little communities,
right.
proto bees, as we call it, and the bee is just a bee, game A.
Oh, right. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's all laid out in a movie on Rebel Wisdom on the history of game B, which is actually quite interesting for people who might want to look at the background on it.
Right.
Basically, Brett Weinstein and I go through the early history of Game B with David Fuller, and we address all these things, where the name Game B came from, and
right,
and such. So I'm now quite convinced that the Davos man approach is not going to work and could well result in a fascist tyranny emerging all over the world. We have to do a more radical jump and jump to a place where we rethink what well-being means and create ways of living in which well-being is going up, not going down. And that's our game B theory. Let's create these communities, and then particularly as well-being starts going down, as Davos man just beats on people, more people will want to move from game A to game B until over time we reach a tipping point. Probably around 15%, could be between 3% and 15% of the population, somewhere in there. A really well thought out and well articulated philosophy of how to live can actually tip the whole system very radically. Again, this is complex systems thinking. We go back to various phase changes in human history. I'm currently doing deep reading on the French Revolution, and it's surprising how small the body of people who did the first good step in the French Revolution were. And that's actually quite hopeful that these kinds of social phase changes are possible. Of course, French Revolution went to hell when it was captured by the populist fascists, essentially, the Robespierre and Marat and their friends. And that's another warning, right? Which is you have to build they didn't build the institutional structures. They were all philosophers, right? They had lots of good ideas, some great ideas, some of the best ideas ever, but they had not thought through the institutional structure. It took them too long to get a functioning government on the other side of it. And that allowed the opportunity for the populist fascists to seize control in the summer of 1793. And then we had the famous terror where, most of the philosophers had their heads chopped off. So, so not a great example overall, but the first part was a very interesting example. So that's, in a nutshell, how I see Game B addressing climate change, which is very indirectly. Show a better way that increases human well-being at a much lower level of consumption. Let Davos man pound on the people until they're hating it more and more, and then they'll move over to game B till we reach a phase transition tipping point in the complex system space, and then voila, the world is game B.
Wow. Okay. So no, I'm all for it, but the systemic.
But it won't happen tomorrow. It won't happen tomorrow. It might take 40 years, 50 years.
Right. No, I'm all for it. The question for me is still the same. It's an efficacy question. It's like, okay, so you have game A, and game A created all the havoc it did create, economically wise,
and all the good. Let's not forget game A moved humanity from basically dire poverty.
Sure.
And a lot of good in game A, and that's another discussion for another day. So
of course, that's not the point. The point is that if you look at let's say human nature, whatever that is, it's like, okay, so that if you look at consciousness alone, I would say like 94% of all cognitive processing is mostly unconscious, right? And so we're just like basically observers of what we're doing, but we have no handling and grip on desire, let's say, right, or rivalry. It's very hard. Then you have
it's not impossible, and
no, but
and you kind of simplified system, Kahneman's system 1 and system 2 thinking, Kahneman and Tversky's idea that a lot of our thinking is basically reflex, right? Is programmed by our environment and by our genes, but humans have system 2, which is the ability to apply rationality. And balancing rationality, reflex, and emotion is part of the capacity upgrade that we need to bring to humans as we move towards game B. And we have to be careful not to overestimate how much change is possible in human capacity. But I think there's a lot of signs that there's significant ability to upgrade human capacity, both in terms of things like being more in balance and transparent with one's emotions. Just something as simple as the mindfulness revolution, which is still a small percentage of people,
right,
produces an interesting change in capacity. Psychedelic drugs do as well. I can tell from
if I may interrupt you, because
okay.
I wanted to make a specific point that still the question lingers if we're not better off. I phrase it a bit provocatively. So if we would not be better off just to stand back and look what the system is doing without meddling with it, because it's like we don't know what we're doing. We really don't. And so because we brought us into this mess, there are all these social and cognitive and biological forces we have no control, even like geographical forces that shape our decision making, everything. And so there are so many cases when we started to meddle with systems that created a worse outcome that if we would just had left the system alone. And so that's the original question. How do you model that? How do you measure the different possible outcomes against each other?
All I can do is think about them. I like to think about them as bundles of trajectories. It's always a false claim that you can use these kinds of systems insights to predict the future.
Right.
All you can talk about is a bundle of trajectories and maybe roughly assess some probabilities against them. But it is actually for exactly this reason, the fact that we can't say what a major manipulation in a big complex system will do, that we have opted in game B to take the opposite approach, to start small, experiment, and build. And if we're wrong, we just go away. Let's suppose we build 50 or 100 proto-Bs. Let's say 100, there's 15,000 people who are living their lives. There's maybe a couple of hundred game B companies, and they all fail. The harm done to the world system is negligible, right? Just some fools who were doing something that didn't make any sense. On the other hand,
the catastrophe will come anyhow in that sense.
And so so we didn't save the day, but we didn't do any harm either.
Right. No, that makes complete sense. Yes.
Mm-hmm. But if we succeed and we grow exponentially, as Einstein said, the second most amazing thing he ever learned after relativity was the power of compound interest. And so again, a key part of the game B thinking is if we can keep an exponential growth going for a number of years, many years, the numbers get pretty big, right?
Right.
And so this bottom-up approach is risk mitigating against exactly the kind of arrogant thinking that I think you're at least indirectly pointing to. We're not taking game A and turning the knobs, right?
Right.
That is unpredictable. Now, and I think the game A people have to be thinking really carefully about how to turn the knobs. And if they don't, then heaven help us. But it'll actually help game B. Game B will do it the opposite way, the bottom up, small scale until we're big. At that point, either we successfully undermine game A, as we say, parasitize game A until it collapses, or we don't. But we're not proposing for us to go meddle with the knobs of game A.
Right.
Very different, very radically different approach. I don't know anybody else who is thinking about this in this way, where we essentially Buckminster Fuller type thinking.
He was amazing. Yes, amazing.
Let's just build it and show them, and then if they like it, they will come, and if they don't, we will fail.
Critical path. That's such a wonderful metaphor. No, if we need this critical path to collaborate and to bring all these forces together.
Now, on the other hand, let me do say that I do encourage Game A to try to reform itself. And on the other hand, I'm relatively skeptical that it can successfully do so.
Right.
But it should try. To my mind, an example of something that's worth trying, but most countries are scared to do it, is a carbon tax. Talk about a systemic way of encouraging, setting out a broad but subtle signal to everybody that it makes sense to use less carbon, and do it in a revenue neutral way where all the tax receipts from the carbon tax are refunded to the citizenry per capita. Everybody gets the same payment. That basically means that it doesn't cause, on average, any loss of wealth or income to people, but it redistributes income to people who are careful with their carbon utilization. It's the damn near perfect signal. And yet all the governments in the world are afraid of it. Just as an example, governments, Game A people, here's some free advice from Game B. Go do that. And start small. Again, use humility. Start with a 50 euro per ton carbon tax. And then if it doesn't cause a massive problem, increase it gradually over 20 years till you're at 200 euros per ton, and you will very substantially fix the carbon crisis. Now, it is true that there could be unanticipated side effects. And that's just life.
So another concept I still remember from that time when I was reading those books were catastrophe theory, right? I think the guy was called Per Buck. And so he had like this beautiful sand
pile model.
That's it. And so, when I look at our society as a whole, it's like there is some aversion of integrate, because as far as I remember, and you may correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I remember, catastrophes are always there and always will be there. The question is like how much sand you put on the pile. And then there are like these huge shifts, and you see it like Bitcoin course going up and down. You see it like everywhere. And I see in Game A, in this society, an aversion to integrating that very fact. We're risk averse, and we are basically afraid of death. You see it with the COVID crisis and everything. But catastrophes are, part of our life. We will die, and if the time axis is long enough, also we as a humankind will die at some point. So
what you're getting at here is what we call in the complexity system space the realization that large-scale events, particularly for highly complex systems and particularly for social systems, but it does apply to physical systems like Per Buck's sand piles, also applies to earthquakes, for instance.
Right.
Is they're distributed on a power law. And you go, what the hell does that mean? Basically it's an exponential. And it basically means that really big things are going to happen way more often than you think they will.
Right.
For instance, the 2008 financial crisis, the idiot modelers who looked at it as Gaussian distribution said, oh, this is, 16 sigma events, 16 standard deviations, which means it had never happened in the history of the universe, but based on their models. Total bullshit. If you'd used the power law model that the people at Santa Fe Institute did, including people who had published it in 2007, they would predict an event at 2008 to be about 1 in 100 years. And isn't it interesting? We had the Great Depression, then we had 2008, about 100 years apart. And so the fat tails mean that you got to be ready for big things to happen more often than you think.
Right.
Another interesting complex systems result from the Battelle National Labs, United States, who are the principal modelers, or one of the principal modelers of the electrical grid in the United States. It turns out grid failures are power law distributed. The electricity goes out in your house and your 5 neighbors. That's a small scale event. All the lights in Europe going out, that's a big event. If you plot those on a graph against time, you will see that they're power law distributed, meaning a total collapse of the grid will happen at some point, and at a rate way higher than naive estimators are likely to think that it will happen. And again, I would say that one of the ways that complexity informs Game B is that we know these big fluctuations will come. and we will be prepared to take advantage of them. I will say, for instance,
that would be my next question. How? Because like if you look, you can look at civilizations, their uprising and their fall basically after a certain time. You can look at certain patterns and empires, like, and even somebody like Brett Weinstein had the idea that, you know, there's not now, but you know, the idea or the possibility that a civil war or a war in itself will come at some point. It's not unthinkable, right? And so you have you have all these crises, this meta crisis, and so I mean, you answer that in one part, but you know, on a larger, on a more systematic scale, like how do you deal like with the inevitable with this, I'm sorry, with the, you know, possibility of catastrophe of all these meta crises in terms of game B. So like,
I'll give you some examples.
Right.
COVID has been great for game B. The number of people with ears to hear our story has grown at least 10x, and it might be 100x.
Oh, really?
In the last 2 years. People thought we were crazy before, right? And they said,
right.
Well, maybe not quite as crazy as we thought. Even people who in the past I've talked to Game B about, and who again, oh, what the hell kind of drugs you've been taking, are now saying, you know, there is something to what you've been saying, that there's something fundamentally wrong with our social operating system, particularly the catastrophically inept response of the West. It's gotten people thinking. And also it's just highlighted the fact that supply chains can break. So small, you know, is a thing to remind people, COVID is not the big one when it comes to pandemics.
No.
COVID is, you know, it's a medium-sized event. It's certainly, we will certainly have pandemics much worse than COVID in the future. And we'll have other events much larger than COVID in the future. So Game B says, most of those bad events are actually good for moving people from game A to game B. In terms of the really big ones, the collapsian scenarios or civil war or a solar flare, et cetera, we put those into our thinking about game Bs. For instance, proto-Bs will be as self-sufficient, will be reasonably self-sufficient initially, but are designed so that if they have to be, they can be totally self-sufficient. You know, we won't have enough electrical power generated on site in most cases to fully operate everything, but we'd have enough to get by if we had to. You know, if we had to cut things back further, this is controversial and probably scary to some people. Every proto-B will have a militia. It will have people who are trained to defend the proto-B if it comes to that. And we'll have an armory with weapons, including some pretty scary ones. Because part of the bundle of trajectories is civil war or civil collapse. You know, probability might only be 20%, say in the next 50 years, but that's a pretty big number, and it's foolish not to have a plan and capacity to deal with the reality of such an event, even if you don't need to use it. So there's at least, you know, there's a bundle of examples there on how we can take advantage of these medium-sized fluctuations and be prepared to do better than other groups in the event of large-scale fluctuations. Right.
And so, okay, so because, I mean, game A, game B, which are basically metaphors for operating systems or how a society works.
Basins of attraction, operating systems.
Yeah, whatever. And so you have two, wouldn't you expect large catastrophes in the transition from one operating system to another one? Because, you know, you just said, okay, so COVID led to an increase of listeners or participants in game B. And so wouldn't you expect that crisis or catastrophes like COVID need to appear so we can move from one operating system to another one? Like, what is the relationship between operating system and catastrophes, let's say?
Let's go back to my salad bowl analogy, right? Catastrophes are shaking of the salad bowl, right? And power law distribution means that they're happening all the time. Some of them are tiny. You know, somebody's TikTok video that riles people up is a tiny little shake of the salad bowl. while the financial crisis of 2008 was a pretty big shaking of the salad bowl. COVID was a bit bigger shaking of the salad bowl. If we have a general war in Europe over Ukraine, that's a really big shaking of the salad bowl. And so these, just like earthquakes, are happening all the time, right? Literally all the time, all day long. There are earthquakes going on all around the world. Most of them so small you'll never feel it, even if they happen under your feet. The same is true on social shaking. And so when you're thinking about moving from one regime to another, you can use the energy of even the medium-sized shakes to help, build the new attractor. So let's say the way COVID has amazingly helped not just Game B, but all of the the big change people. I talk to these people all the time, and all of them agree that the ears to hear have increased massively for their version of the story over the last 2 years. So we will take advantage of them at all scales, and we'll be prepared to differentially do better in the events of big and particularly adverse ones.
Does everybody monitor and model these catastrophes and this shaking in terms of social movements and social events? Is there like I think there's like an internet observatory who does like, but I don't, it's like, is there like a kind of observatory that models these kinds of shifts in catastrophes?
Not formally. It would actually be a good thing to do, but I'm not aware of anybody that does that. And of course, the Internet Observatory does, its own thing. What's her name?
Rena DiResta.
Yeah, she was on my podcast, and we had a very good talk about what they do. And
she had amazing essay, the digital Maginot Line, about the information war as a kind of third world war, something like that.
Yeah, and of course, Rob, who's been on my podcast many times, talks about 4G war and 5G war. And his argument is we're already in both a global war and a civil war simultaneously being fought out in meme space. And yes-ish. But it's really politics and propaganda that's more effective than it used to be. It isn't actually war yet, but it is like war. In the same way Clausewitz, the famous military strategist, said that war is politics by other means. I would argue that what we're currently seeing is more like extreme politics and isn't quite yet war, but it is up close to the boundary.
Yeah, well, it's not a military war per se, but I imagine, in the 40s, the common theme people were talking about was the war, and it was creating rifts in society and families and friends. And if I look around now, it's like the fault lines, and it's like only because of COVID. It's just like taking COVID and what it does to families and friends and our whole society, and it makes people crazy too. Yeah, it's a form of long COVID that we all have by now, and that's so complicated. It's like, yeah.
Indeed. So just to sort of wrap up on this, we take as a given that there will be shaking of the bowl all the time: teeny shakes, big shakes, monster shakes, and huge shakes. And we think about how to take advantage of the small and medium shakes and how to be prepared for the big shakes.
Right.
But it's also very important that one of the things that we learn from complex systems thinking is to try to predict when any particular shake will happen is a fool's game. You could say we would expect a COVID level event every 50 years, or a financial crisis 2008 every 100 years. But what year it actually happens in, there's absolutely no way to tell.
No, but as a metaphor, if you look at the course development of Bitcoin, if you just the pattern analysis where you can say, so it's probably that something will happen in the next 2 weeks or 2 months, in that direction or in that direction. You can pretty fairly, if you use pattern recognition, you can fairly good predict, and so I would think.
Actually, you can't, it turns out, but
no, you can't.
No, in fact, Santa Fe Institute has done a lot of research that shows that technical analysis is close to useless.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's not quite useless. In fact, my own work at the Santa Fe Institute was on price formation, micro price formation in markets just like Bitcoin. There is a structure to what happens, and it's power law distributed, and it's one can explain it in terms of conflicting trading strategies and the conflicts them and the opportunity spaces that arise. But the outcome is chaotic.
Right.
It can't predict the future more than a few minutes in with any reliability at all.
Right.
Because if you could, you'd be rich. Right?
That's true.
And so be very, very skeptical of technical analysis on Bitcoin prices.
Right.
I mean, I can show you why it may be possible to predict it out a few minutes, maybe 45 minutes. But beyond that, you're into the reign where chaos reigns. And what we should fall back on is knowing that the moves will be power law distributed.
Right.
And think of strategies that allow you to take advantage of movements that are bigger than people think they will be. That people are always surprised when it drops 30%. Not surprising at all to me. I knew that would happen. In fact, I knew it was probably going to happen fairly soon. So last fall, I unloaded about 40% of my crypto hoard, and I kept 60 because I wasn't sure. And so far, turned out to have been a good trade. We'll see. Yeah. So yeah. Anyway.
Okay. So one last question that I wanted to ask you. So if we look at our society and we have this destructive competition, when you look at economies and what they do and how they ravage through nature and so on and so forth, that you have on one side, and I think it's clear that we have to find a way to mitigate, I think is the word, or to reduce it. On the other side, you have competition and rivalry as a basic human trait, I would say.
Absolutely.
How do you harmonize those two things? How do you get from because like you find it in animals, you find it in mating strategies and all of this, and how do you harmonize all these tendencies and drives in a way, or integrate them in a way that they're not getting destructive?
I'll give you a couple answers there. One of the key ideas in Game B is the idea of the multipolar trap, where even if people want to not do the bad thing, they can easily be forced into the bad thing by one actor. Very simple example. Let's imagine we have 5 soft drink companies who all use cane sugar in their soft drinks. Along comes high fructose corn syrup, which is worse for you and a lot cheaper. And everybody stays in the cane sugar world until one actor, let's say a sociopath, says, I can get rid of the corn, I can get rid of the cane sugar, substitute high fructose corn syrup, cut my costs by 20%, make a lot more money, and or invest back in growing my market share. And so even if the other guys don't want to do it, they're forced into it by the multipolar trap because the bad actor gets a competitive advantage from that. Solving the multipolar trap is one of the key theoretical questions of Game B. And we have some rough ideas, ideas like guilds or oversight on moves so that they are not of the multipolar trap race to the bottom sort. Form of regulated competition may well be the answer, but I can't lay out a detailed, provable way to address the multipolar trap, but we got to do it. Right. On the more human side, I think this is actually more interesting, is that one of the horrible things about late stage Game A is that almost everything is collapsed into a single dimension of merit, money, right? Money and sex, money and happiness, so-called, money and money, everything's reduced to money. And so people compete for money. How sad is it that the best and the brightest of our generations want to go into law, management, consulting, and finance? I mean, fuck that, right? Why aren't they scientists and artists or heck, courtesans, right? All of which are more honorable professions in terms of human well-being. Because we've collapsed the status signal to money, so people chase the almighty dollar.
Right.
Imagine a world where we acknowledge many dimensions in which one can distinguish oneself. So that's, I like to say, distinguish oneself, and even though it is somewhat competitive. So let's say you're a really good violin player, and so you have the sense of, in the world, and your friends and your neighbors and the people in your community give you status as a great violinist, right? And let's suppose I'm a really good potato farmer, right? I have high status in potato farming, and somebody else in quilt making, and somebody else in childcare, and somebody else in let's see. I
get the point. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So anyway, the idea is that kind of like, I don't know if you have them in Germany, the Boy Scouts we have in the United States, where there's like 120 merit badges you can get in all these different domains. And so I'm imagining game B competition. I call it distinguishing oneself, but it is competition at some level, is in many dimensions. And that is everybody will find something that they can distinguish themselves in to some degree. And that is so much more healthy than to collapse the competition of status around this one dimension. Right.
I'm just thinking, when you were talking about this, about evolution of cooperation, I think that's the book's title of Axelrod. Is that the book's title?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and so it's like, because you mentioned those bad faith actors, there's the guys who are always like pushing the system in the wrong direction, and then you have like they're always winning if competing with simple good guys, and so Axelrod proposed that you need like a different strategy, like I think he called it eye for an eye, so that you cooperate.
Tit for tat.
Tit for tat. That's it. Yes.
Yeah, tit for tat works in the very simple model of iterated prisoner's dilemma.
Right.
But it does not work in multipolar traps in the business world. Think about the five soft drink manufacturers. How do you implement tit for tat in that world? The answer is you can't. You need another solution.
Right.
Tit for tat is a very brilliant insight, and Axelrod is a very brilliant guy who I recommend people read. But he does not provide the answer to the multipolar trap.
Right. All right. Mr. Rutt, I think we got it.